Alrighty, we're going to finish up Reid today. As has been my mantra for the last half of the semester, I'm going to try to go through this really quickly. And I'm going to have to skip over a lot. If you thought Kant was difficult without visual aids, which, by the way, I'm putting up today, then some of the stuff I was originally going to lecture on with Reid will be impossible without visual aids. And it's some of the sophisticated geometry that I was going to explain on the board. It will simply be too difficult to do, even with the supplementary material. So I'm going to move very quickly over some of that stuff to give you at least the basis, but I won't be able to do it. I mean, it's non-Euclidean hyperbolic geometry, which Reid seems to have invented 60 years or so before mathematicians, namely guys like Riemann, did in the mid-19th century. And Reid doesn't seem to have recognized that what he was doing was a completely new sort of geometry, or if he did realize it, he didn't think it was as important investigating that on a theoretical, mathematical level as simply responding to the philosophical debates of his day. So we're gonna spend some time on chapter 6. Not the whole chapter, of course, the second half of chapter 6, but specifically chapters like section 24. Let me make sure that that's the right section here. It's 24. Yep, how perception is analogous to the trust we have in human testimony. Okay, so one of the things Reid wants to ask is, why is it that for someone like Hume, we have this trust in, I'm searching through the text to find the exact quote that I want here. Hume has this trust in reason, right? So if you remember back to Hume's relations of ideas and matters of fact, remember, relations of ideas, Hume says, like, those are the provenance of reason. Those are the things we can know, that we can understand in a rigorous way, sufficiently strong that we can't logically deny them or something. And of course, the matters of fact don't enjoy that level of rigorous justification. And Reid wants to suggest that we have the same justification for accepting things which are the provenance of the senses. That is to say, we have the same justification for accepting things that we see, smell, hear, touch, and taste that we have for the things that we judge to be true necessarily or otherwise by reason. He's got this great little quote here. He says, this is not, this is, boy, I'm doing really great, aren't I? I thought I had the right section. This makes for some excellent lecture material. You'd think I would have had this set forth ahead of time, which I did. I dog-eared it, but of course now I'm not finding it, and I can't pause this thing. If I do that, then it just stops it. So you're just going to have to suffer with me here. Here we go. So, almost 4 minutes into this thing, I've said almost nothing of use. That's a wonderful use of your time. I apologize. Anyway, so he says, why should I believe the faculty of reason more than that of perception? They came both out of the same shop and were made by the same artist. If he puts one piece of false ware into my hands, what should hinder him from putting another? In other words, what he's saying is, look, both reason and our perceptive, the beliefs that we form from reason and the beliefs we form from perception come from the same source, right? Whether you want to call that source nature or God or whatever, the fact is that even say along evolutionary lines, we developed the power, say, to see the world through the evolutionary process in the same way that we developed the ability to think abstractly and to use reason. That was also formed through the evolutionary process. Or if you want to say it was by God, you can say it's by God as well. But what Reid wants to ask is, why would we suggest that, oh, well, reason's the sort of thing we can trust, but this thing is the sort of thing we should be skeptical about, if they both are rooted fundamentally in the same source, right? He says, well, if I have reason to be skeptical of one, why not the other? Okay. And so he's going to go along, and of course, in the background here are his principles of common sense. In this case, it's going to be a principle of common sense that we accept as true the things that we see. Now, of course, he's aware of the optical illusions, say, or sometimes you think you hear someone say one thing and they've said another. I mean, he's not oblivious to these things, but merely pointing out that that there's a possibility that you are mistaken is insufficient, right? I mean, think back to high school or even college math courses, right? I mean, you have to take, you do a lot of problems, a lot of homework, right? You just go over. The idea is that if you practice and practice, right? Then you'll sort of be able to grasp, hopefully grasp, or at least memorize, I suppose, the proper equations and sort of understand the underlying relations among the variables that you're working with. And we all, I imagine anyway, certainly this is true of me, we all had the experience of getting an answer wrong, right? And we get the answer wrong because we made a mistake, right? Somewhere along the reasoning, we made a mistake. And we wouldn't think that the appropriate response to having made even one mistake, to say nothing of the many I made throughout all the years I worked in math classes as a student, we wouldn't think that it was a proper conclusion to draw that, well, sometimes I make mistakes in math, which are fundamentally mistakes in reasoning. I've reasoned improperly with regard to the relations of these numbers and so forth. And therefore, reason is the sort of thing I shouldn't be able to trust, right? That's just obviously absurd, especially because you can go back and see where you made the mistake in reasoning, right? And so, this is why your teacher will often, they don't just say wrong. A good teacher, in math will also say, no, this is where you made the mistake, point to maybe the part of the equation or depending on how sophisticated the math gets, they'll be able to show you exactly where you made your mistake, right? Well, that's the same way perception works, right? If you get clubbed on the head in battle and start seeing things that otherwise aren't there, well, we go, okay, we can explain why you're seeing that, right? Or at least we can explain why you believe you're seeing that. Just like the math teacher pointing to the mistake you made in reasoning, we can, as it were, point to the cause of the mistake of your judgment that, hey, I see a dancing elephant. I don't know, right? That's a good example. Think of Dumbo, right? He has these truly horrifying. As a child, I hated this scene in Dumbo, if you've seen it. Dumbo gets really drunk. So yes, that's a great kid's story, huh? He gets hammered, really, really, really hammered in a scene. Like his snout goes into a bottle of whiskey, I guess. I can't remember if it's whiskey or beer or whatever. And he drinks it, and it's kind of cute. Like every gulp, you see like his snout kind of goes, and he gets really hammered, and he starts hallucinating, and he sees these giant pink elephants, and they're singing, and it's, at least as a kid, it was a really terrifying experience. Right? But the next morning, Dumbo insisted upon, we've got to find these pink elephants. They are somewhere around here, and they are horrific. His friends might be like, when did you see them? And they'd be like, well, last night. And they'd be like, dude, you were hammed. You were completely out of it last night. I mean, we would be able to explain that. And so it wouldn't then follow, because we now have an explanation for the mistake, it wouldn't follow in the same way that when we have an explanation of a mistake in math, it wouldn't follow that you can't trust your senses, right? We can explain why it is that you formed a false belief or made an error in judgment or something. Okay. Now this is relevant because if you recall, one of Reid's critiques against Hume is that Hume just assumes the representationalist framework. In other words, he says Hume never tries to defend why it is that the representationalist framework is the best foundation for epistemology. And Hume responds, actually, I don't think he responds directly. Gosh, I can't remember now. I don't believe, if I recall, that he responds directly to Reid. This is through a friend. He's telling his friend, well, Reid says this about me. And Hume says, no, well, I can tell you why. And the reason is, he says, more or less, when you get closer to something, it gets larger. And as you move farther away from it, it gets smaller. Just as you guys are noticing in this video, as I move closer to the camera, I seem to grow a little bit. As I move farther away, I seem to get a little bit smaller. And Hume says, now, we have no reason to think the size of the object we're seeing is changing. It's not the case that as I get closer to the camera, I must actually be growing, and as I get farther away, I must actually be shrinking. Hume says, we have no reason to accept that. So what's the best explanation? He says, well, it's the idea in the mind has changed, right? As I move closer, I get a new idea. That's the best way of explaining this change. So it's the idea rather that changes, not the object itself. That's Hume's defense of representationalism. Notice it's quite different from Descartes, right? Descartes is much more systematic. He sort of finds himself at the end of the second meditation having to conclude representationalism. Now, Reid is going to suggest, he calls these the fallacies of vision. He's going to say, I don't blame you for having assumed or come to these sort of bizarre conclusions about the nature of sight. Lots of people do this. They might not come to the idea of belief in representationalism. I mean, very few non-philosophers do. But Reid says, we might think all sorts of weird things about the nature of sight and draw strange conclusions about it if we haven't done the rigorous work of optics. In other words, if we don't understand the geometry of light and its interplay with the eye, then you might be forgiven for coming to these bizarre conclusions. And yet, Reid says, Hume explicitly, remember I've harped on this before, Hume explicitly says he wants to undertake a rigorous scientific Newtonian-style investigation up, and or take up a rigorous Newtonian-style investigation. And so Reid says, for someone who's claiming that he's doing this rigorous Newtonian-style scientific investigation, you sure don't seem to actually be doing it, right? And he's going to suggest, a rigorous Newtonian-style investigation into optics and the geometry of light and of sight, what he calls the geometry of visibles, will show you that actually we can explain using mathematical reasoning, that is to say, the sort of thing that Hume would think we can't deny, right? The sorts of things we can know, we can understand. Reid says I can use geometry to show you why it is things might look one way to us, and despite the fact that we know that out there they are not that way. That is to say, they're not presenting, they are not out there, in fact, the way that they appear to us to look. Okay, and so his example, and this is where I would draw it on the board, and I would actually sort of show you. It's incredibly complicated geometry. It's geometry. I want to say I don't pretend to fully understand. Okay, I get a good amount of it. I had a lot of help in graduate school. I took a course on the visual system, and we did work in optics and geometry, and I spent a lot of time with the professor because this was just a course in a science department. But I did a lot of work with the professor using Reid, because I had Reid in the back of my mind when I took this class, to sort of work through the math to really try to understand as best as my pea brain can the complicated geometry. So I don't pretend to be an expert on this. I don't pretend to be able to rigorously defend this. I don't have the mind for it. But suffice to say, Reid absolutely did. He was a phenomenal mathematician and had worked in optics. That's why the chapter of seeing is the largest of all the chapters in the inquiry. He goes through every sense modality. If you notice, the chapters are set up of smelling, of seeing, of tasting, right? Because he thinks, if we're going to claim that the only things we can know come through our senses, which he does, he agrees with Hume here, he is an empiricist, then we have to understand the senses. We have to understand how they work. The chapter of seeing is the longest because Reid had done a lot of work in optics and in the math, the geometry behind light and seeing and so forth. Okay, so his example, it's I think at least conceptually, I don't have to draw it on the board for you, but beyond merely giving it to you, I can't spend too much more time on it without a board and going through more in detail. But the pith of it is this. If you put your eye in the center of a sphere, right, so a three-dimensional sphere, and your eye is at the very center of that sphere, anything that you put onto the surface of that sphere, so suppose the sphere is clear, it's see-through, anything that you place upon the surface of the sphere is going to look curved, right? Because the surface that the thing would be projected on is curved. And so a straight line is going to look curved along the sphere. And you can imagine this, right? And in fact, it takes a lot. If you've ever been to a planetarium, these planetariums, which as a kid, I loved planetariums because space just always kind of fascinated me. It's so vast and everything's so huge and so powerful. But when you go to a planetarium, most planetariums, I suppose, planetary probably in Latin, but planetariums, they're curved on the top. And it used to always really fascinate me as a child that you'd go into the planetarium and you could see the top of it was curved, but as soon as they turned out the lights and started flashing stuff on there, it didn't look curved anymore, right? That actually takes a remarkable amount of geometry to trick you into thinking that what you're seeing isn't curved at all, but is rather sort of flat. Anyway, so what Reid does is he says, okay, so everything that's projected onto the sphere is going to look curved. He says, well, here's an exception to that rule. Take three lines, so you're going to form a triangle. One of the lines, he calls these great circles. So a great circle on a sphere, one of them would be an equator, an equatorial circle, right? So imagine the globe. The equator runs right through or right around the center of the sphere, right? It's not like the lines. If you go towards the North Pole, the circle is going to be smaller, right? As you get towards the middle, they grow. Then you get the largest one, and then it starts shrinking again. So you get to that largest one. We call that an equatorial circle, right? So one of the three is going to be an equatorial circle running around the sphere. Another one is going to be like a prime meridian, right? So it's the same size as the equatorial circle, but it's just running, north to south instead of east to west. And you can take a third great circle that goes this way, right? So you've got an equator, you've got a meridian, and then you've got this third great circle going like this. All three the same size. Now they're going to form, there's going to be a point, a couple of them actually, where all three of those meet, right? And then from that, you'll be able to make, sort of as it were, slice out a triangle, okay? If you're having a hard time envisioning this, that's fine. Again, I would have drawn this on the board to make it clearer, but right now, trust me on this, it works. Okay. Now he says what you're going to do is you're going to slice. If you sort of look at that triangle, we know that because the lines are curved, right? So the lines are going to look like this. If you've got the top, rather than going straight and straight, they're going to be kind of curved and curved, right? Like that, okay? If you measure the angles of the triangle, they will sum to more than 180 degrees, okay? That's an interesting fact, right? This has now been proved in hyperbolic non-Euclidean geometry. Reid is actually sort of discovering non-Euclidean geometry 60, 70 years before anyone else gets credit for it. To this day, Reid doesn't really get credit for it. It astonishes me. It's right there in the inquiry. He's discovering non-Euclidean geometry. And that, just imagine the genius of that, right? I mean, to take someone like Euclid, whose geometry was seen as the only way to do geometry for the better part of 2,000 years up to Reid's lifetime, and then for Reid to discover a geometry and work out proofs that is non-Euclidean, it just betrays a subtle mind. And then for him to not seek it out, he should have published this in mathematical journals as well as here in the Inquiry. He would have been known as the founder of non-Euclidean geometry. Why he didn't, I don't know. But anyway, so the point is, you've got these circles, or you've got these lines, rather these triangles whose inner angles sum to more than 180 degrees. Now here's the relevant point to the philosophy. If your eye is in the center of this sphere, and you've got this triangle, which is made up by the intersecting, the vectors, 3 vectors of these great circles, in the center of the sphere, they won't look bent at all. They'll look straight. And if you add up the angles of this rectilinear triangle, you will see 180 degrees, right? So his point is, we know, because again, his geometry shows this, he proves this, we know that those lines can't be straight and that their inner angles have to sum to more than 180 degrees. And yet we also know, again, using, in this case, optics, and the geometry from optics, we know that if your eye sits in the center of that sphere, it's going to look straight, and the angles are going to look like they sum to 180 degrees. Okay, and now we know that the optics stuff, we know that because even though the eye is not perfectly spherical, when the light enters into the eye, a huge chunk of it is reflected off the cornea. A lot of it, as it enters into the lens, is refracted, right? So as it hits into the lens, it doesn't go straight to the back of the retina. It sort of refracts, and a lot of it gets shot into parts of the eye that you don't see, that you don't perceive, because they're only the parts of the retina, the cones and the rods and so forth, that are going to generate a visual stimulus for you. Once you work out all of that math, all of that geometry, the remaining light, more or less, works as though it's working within a perfect sphere. This is stuff that had been figured out well before Reid's lifetime. So that's how we know, that's why he uses a sphere as an example, because sight more or less does sort of work on a spherical geometry. Okay, so the whole point of all of this is that Reid says we can know mathematically, we can prove deductively, right? In other words, we can know this as a relation of ideas, if you want to use Humean terminology, that the eye in the center of this sphere would apprehend a rectilinear triangle, and yet we know that the triangle itself would not be rectilinear. It would be hyperbolic, okay, non-Euclidean. And so that's how he's going to respond to Hume, more or less. I mean, he's just going to suggest, look, I can show you with geometry why it is that things in the world would be one way, and that why we would perceive them in another way. For instance, the fact that I'm moving closer to you, I look bigger, I move away, I look smaller. What Reid wants to suggest is we can work out a geometry to explain that, right? And that geometry proves both that the world would look to us a certain way, and also proves that the world would be a certain way in order for it to look the way it does to us, right? In other words, we can not only prove that the triangle put upon the sphere is hyperbolic, I can prove that, I can also prove that it would look to me a certain way, and because I'm using geometric proofs, I can also know why it is that it looks to me a certain way. By necessity, it would have to look to me that way because of the laws of geometry, and by necessity, why it wouldn't look that way out there. So it bridges that gap. It's exactly the gap Hume says can't be bridged, right? It's exactly the gap that leads Hume to representationalism. And what Reid is saying is, no, we don't need this bizarro theory that leads us to Humean skepticism. We have the equipment using our senses plus reason. We have the equipment to be able to give a proof for why it is that the world looks a certain way, and why it is sometimes it might not always actually be that way. But because the geometric proofs, I can know what it's like, right? Okay, so that's all pretty heady stuff. So then Reid needs to then prove, or at least show why it is, because notice I said it's reason plus perception, right? Well, now then, in order for that all to work, Reid's got to give a justification for why it is we ought to trust perception at all. And that's why I started with that quote where he says, why should I trust reason over the senses if they both come from the same source, right? So if we're trusting reason, there is, at least in principle, no reason beyond justification. That is to say, you'd have to give an argument to suggest why it is we shouldn't also trust perception, okay? And so what he's going to do then is he's going to suggest that perception works, I should also suggest that he also makes plain that you don't have to do all this geometry in order to be justified in the belief, in forming beliefs from your perception. He's sort of suggesting there is a groundwork of geometry, of math, of science that can justify these things if you're the sort of person who really needs to dig down deep and do so. Most people aren't that way, either because they don't have the time, they don't have the ability, or they don't have the inclination to wonder about that. And he wants to suggest those people are still justified, right? In the same way you can be justified in using your reasoning for, say, looking both ways before you cross the road. Someone says, why'd you look both ways? You'd say, because I don't want to be a dead person, right? I don't want to be a mess for somebody to clean up. That's a use of reasoning, right? You don't have to understand the basics, or not the basics, but the overall structure and inner workings of logic, Reid wants to suggest, in order to justify this little argument you've run through your head. I don't want to end up a dead person. If I get hit, I'll end up a dead person. Therefore, I want to avoid getting hit. Looking both ways helps me to avoid getting hit. Therefore, I'm going to look both ways. Right? I mean, that's an argument. Right? Reid wants to suggest you don't have to be a master logician to be justified in using that sort of reasoning. Right? Nonetheless, if you're going to talk to someone like Hume, this sort of justification is available to you, right? Either by being a master logician in case of reason itself, or in terms of optics, say at least for visual perception. Okay. Now, what Reid wants to suggest is that there's this close relationship between the justification on the one hand of perception and justifications for justifications for beliefs which are formed by perception, in this case vision, and justification of beliefs that are formed by language. Okay. So he makes a distinction between, let's see here, it is on the one hand, oh boy. Where is it now? Why would I have turned the page? I thought it was right here in front of me. So this is in section 24 of chapter 6, how perception is analogous to the trust we have in human testimony, right? So he divides perceptions into original perceptions and acquired perceptions. And he divides language into natural language and artificial language. And what he wants to suggest is that acquired perceptions and artificial languages, they have a lot in common, and original perceptions and natural languages have a lot in common, right? So what does he mean by this? Well, so original perception, I'll just read this to you. In original perception, the signs are sensations of which nature has given us a great variety, suited to the variety of things signified by them. Nature has established a real connection between the signs of the things signified, and nature has also taught us how to interpret these signs so that independently of experience, the sign suggests the thing signified and creates a belief in it. Okay, what is this sign signification thing? Well, what he means is that having a certain sensation and an original perception is to have a certain sensation, like at a really abstract level, and to and he wants to suggest that from that sensation you can draw a conclusion immediately, and the fancy word is that sensation is a sign which signifies, that is, which tells you, which points to something out there in the world. And he says nature has fitted us in this way. So a sensation, he means that like in the broadest sense possible, a sensation of you put your hand on a surface and it feels hard, right? What is that signifying to you? I don't know. You probably don't want to run a car into it, You know what I mean? It's signifying to you that this is a surface. This is a hard surface. You probably shouldn't bang your head against it, right? It's not telling you what that surface is. That is to say, whether it's a table or a wall or anything like that. It's just very basic. Same with heat. You put your hand on a surface and it immediately flashes pain, right? What do? I mean, without even thinking, you pull your hand off, right? That's signifying to you heat or energy or whatever, right, in the abstract sense, and it signifies to you that's bad, that's going to hurt me, right? Might be good to put food in that, maybe, but at this very base abstract level, the original perception is heat, hot, or something like that, right? Now, the acquired perception would be something to the effect of that's a stove, right? That heat is coming from either the flame, if it's a gas stove, or coming from like the heating coils, the heating element, if it's an electric stove, right? The acquired would be like you hit the solid surface and you think, oh, the shelf that my computer is currently sitting on is solid, right? So that's the acquired perception. So the original one leads to the acquired one. It's the way we are able to interpret the initial signs, such that, because you can imagine we wouldn't be able to do a whole lot if all we felt was heat, hard, tasted sweet, things like that, right? We have to move beyond the mere sensations to form judgments, not just heat, bad, right? We're not like cavemen, right? But so you take these original signs and then they help you to make particular signs. That is a heating element, right? Okay. So now we have natural and acquired language. He says a natural language is basically, it's non-spoken, it's body language, right? If you see somebody walking around and they're sort of, kind of like, if they're walking on something, go like that, that person doesn't have to tell you anything. You anticipate that person's in pain, right? You can just sort of, ouch, right? And then if you speak to the person, you go, you all right? And the person goes, you know what? I just got this really weird pain right up underneath my ribs, okay? That phrase, I just got this really weird pain up underneath my ribs, that's the artificial language, right? It's artificial because I spoke it in English. English is not a language that all human beings speak by virtue of being human. Lots of people in the world live entirely human lives and never speak a word of English, right? And so it's artificial because it's been created as a means of explaining or giving more detail to, in this case, in the example I've used, more detail that the natural language wouldn't otherwise have given, right? You would see that he's in pain, and you've got an idea it's in this region, but it's the acquired language has allowed us to give more detail and to communicate this more clearly. Okay, so we also look out into the world and we see something beautiful and we go, wow, right? Or maybe you just go like that or something, right? Same sort of thing. And you go, what is it? And you're like, oh, that was a shooting star, right? You can see how this artificial language is helping us to be able to communicate with one another with more detail, more precision, and so forth than the natural language itself. Okay. Now, he thinks that some of these languages have to be innate within us, these natural languages. Go anywhere in the world, you give a baby a shot in the leg like we have to do to our children every, for the first several doctor's visits of their lives. And what happens, even before they cry, they wince, right? That just seems to be natural to all human beings, right? Really, probably to most animals. All animals too, right? In other words, some of these natural languages, they're natural precisely because they're found in all people across all times whose bodies are working correctly. Again, if you've got an inability to feel pain because the C fibers in your body aren't firing correctly, then you might not feel the wince. But again, we can explain that aberration scientifically because now we know that C fibers are a necessary condition for the experience of pain, right? At least in creatures like ourselves. And so that doesn't, if you point this out, all people get stuck with a needle sort of flinch, and someone goes, well, I didn't. Right? That doesn't mean, oh crap, I guess we can't read people's body language anymore. Well, no, you just point out, well, how are C fibers? Oh, no, they don't fire off very well. Well, there you go. Okay, so, but now notice the important thing here. You can see why this relationship between natural language and original perceptions are related, because when you get stabbed in that leg with the my doctor actually doesn't stab me like that when I receive a shot or when our kids receive shots. Thank God. There's that original perception, pain, right? And then you communicate it with a natural language, right? And then you form a judgment, say as an adult, man, I hate shots. They hurt. That's your judgment. Now you've moved from an original perception to an acquired perception. You think in your head, man, the shot hurts. So it's no longer just this abstract pain. Now you've been able to form a judgment about the cause of that pain. That's telling you something about the world. There's something out there that cut into my skin, went subdermal, and then must have probably, put something in there, because you can usually sort of feel that stuff sitting on your muscles for a little bit. And then you notice how I even then said what I was thinking, sort of vocally. You then literally say, man, that shot hurt, right? So it's no longer just a wince from which we can determine pain, but now you're suggesting using language also that that this judgment you've made about the world can more clearly be sort of expressed to others, and likely to yourself too. Sometimes, if you ever had this experience of talking it out, right? You've got this idea, you've got this feeling, this belief, and sometimes you just need to talk it out, right? So it's not just so that you communicate to other people. It has also this sort of feedback loop. Sometimes it helps you to more accurately or with more precision or more articulation, however you want to say it, allows you to be able to form a more accurate belief, about the cause. So now the reason he sets all this up is because, again, he wants to root this all in our natural constitution, but he wants to do it in a way not like Hume, where, again, Hume agrees with Reid that we're constituted in such a way that we can't fail to believe these things. We have to believe these things, right? But Reid wants to suggest, but the justification, remember, Hume thinks there's no justification for these things, right? At least there's no rational justification. The justification is, as it were, just purely sensory or emotional or something like that, custom or habit, right? What Reid wants to say is, well, I mean, it's Reid, and there's some difficulty here. Is it based in reason itself? It's hard to say. Again, exactly what he means by common sense. Sometimes it's it's the dictates of reason. Sometimes it's a description of reason. Reason does seem to be involved in some way, even at sort of a nascent level. Again, here's kind of where he looks a little bit like Kant. I mean, they seem to agree that our experiences, even at the most visceral sort of abstract level, reason is playing a role there. Unlike for Kant, where reason is forming the experience, Reid just thinks reason has constant communication with the experience through these dictates of common sense, right? And so what Reid wants to say is, yes, we can't help but to believe these things, but that's because common sense, our Constitution is rooted in these principles of common sense, and those principles themselves are fundamentally entangled with reason, kind of from the get-go, right? And so here I just want to, we're finishing up, but I just want to suggest to you that, common sense, I think it works. I use this word descriptive and prescriptive, right? So common sense as descriptive, you can hear the word description in there, right? Common sense describes to you why it is, these principles describe to you why it is we act in a certain way. That's kind of the Humean thing, right? Hume thinks he can give an account for why we do things the way we do, custom, right? Reid wants to say, why do we do the things we do? Common sense. So that's a descriptive way of working. But there's also a prescription. Common sense tells you why you have to do things a certain way, right? This comes out more in his ethics than it does in his general epistemology or something. But it sort of serves also a prescriptive function. And here I like to use the example of like a grammar, like a grammar textbook. So say William Smythe, his grammar in Greek, or you've got Basil Gildersleeve's Latin grammar. If you open up these grammar texts, they not only tell you why a sentence is written a certain way, why is that word here? We'll go to the grammar and it'll tell you in Greek how particular uses, say in a positive or something like that, right? Not only does it tell you why a sentence is framed a certain way, but it also tells you how, hey, if you want to write or speak this language well, you have to do these things. The grammar tells you that as well, right? The description and the prescription are very closely sort of knitted together in the nature of a grammar text. And that's more or less what the principles of common sense are for Reid. They not only explain why we do the things that we do, but they also tell us how we ought to do these things as well, right? And that's where I was getting back to, tying this back to what we talked about last week. There's a prescription, I think, in Reid that if you try to look for sort of a deductive proof of some of these first principles, you're just committing a category mistake that is, for Reid, it doesn't even rise to the level of irrationality. It's just meaningless, right? It's like, again, saying that if A equals C and B equals C, but A and B don't equal one another, right? There's a prescription in there, namely, hey, you shouldn't do that, right? So that's how these things work. And because he thinks, again, that we have just as much trust to place in reason as we do, or just as much trust to place in perception as we do in reason, these prescriptions also then are true for perception as well. And likewise, if you try to deny the claim that not just I can't help but believe that the external world, the mind-independent world exists, but if you try to say, but I'm going to pretend as though I don't, or I'm going to hold that belief, I'm going to suspend that belief until I can prove it, or something like that, Reid's going to say that's just a mistake, and it betrays a pathology of a really serious kind, either believing you're made of glass, or thinking you can take a windlass to sort of rip the Earth out of its orbit, or denying mathematical certainties or something like that, right? So this section of seeing, it's not just a description for how it is that we have the experiences we do, even though that is useful, because again, Reid thinks if I can explain why it is things look bigger when they're up close and smaller when they're far away using geometry, then I don't have to get into this weird speculative stuff, right? The description is nice, but the prescriptive part as well, you can actually point out, no, this is bad reasoning. This is a bad way of approaching the world. Even when, straightforwardly speaking, you're not talking about reason. Even when, straightforwardly speaking, you're just talking about the way things appear to you. Reason there still has a means of suggesting, no, that's a bad way of thinking about the world, approaching it, etc. Right? So that's going to be his objection to Hume. What I like also about this section of on seeing is because it doesn't just show that Reid only has Hume in mind and thinks, no, I've got to sort of destroy this guy's false conclusions. Reid is also being a good system, a thinker, building up his own philosophical system as well. Not just saying, not just sort of being a negative, offering negative responses to somebody, but also offering, well, if I'm going to tear down your edifice, I have to build up my own, that sort of thing. And so these sections in the rest of the inquiry are useful for that as well. So that's the Reidian approach. Reidian direct realism suggests that why do I believe that there is, this object in front of me? Because I see it, not because there's some mental representation in my mind, and therefore now the question is, how do I make sure that representation is veridical, right? Reid wants to say, no, I believe it because I see it. Now, of course, there's a mental aspect involved in that. Absolutely, he wouldn't deny that. What he wants to suggest is that I'm seeing it, I'm not seeing merely a mental representation, right? So that's it. That's Reid. Now for I think, what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to end the lectures because the last lecture was going to be on personal identity, and I wanted to do that because Descartes, Hume, Kant, and Reid all talk about personal identity, and so it's a nice way to sort of take all the thinkers, and Locke, whom I sort of introduced in this final section. And so it's a nice way of tying everything together. But fundamentally, I'm just going to be honest, it's not on the midterm, it's not on the final, this last bit of stuff. And you guys have enough going on right now that I don't want to waste your time with stuff that's not fundamentally going to be necessary for you in order to do well in the course. So this will be the last lecture. I'm going to try to plan a time for the final that we can all discuss it, so we can do like a Zoom or something, so that if you guys have any questions or anything, we can spend some time clarifying that, doing it more than just through email. And we still have some time to do that. It'll probably be sometime early next week. I'll send out an email or something. But so this will be the last lecture, and then second to last time you ever have to look at this ugly mug. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Again, we've moved so quickly. I apologize for that. But what can you do? Strange times. So I hope you're well. Hang in there, guys.